Microsoft billionaire Bill Gates told Comedy Central's Trevor Noah that it's quite clear COVID-19 came from bats. Let's watch.
How do we prevent something where we don't even understand how it came to be? Like, are there labs where they need to do better at enclosing the work that they're doing? I understand that they have to do the work, but how do we figure that out, and how do we move forward in that realm?
Well, we should be careful about lab safety. It's quite clear in this case that it came across through animals. Mm-hmm. And almost all our diseases, like HIV, crossed over from chimpanzees in Africa quite some time ago. Ebola came from bats. This also, with one step in between, came from bats. So it's going to keep happening, particularly with climate change, where we're invading a lot of habitats.
Washington Post columnist Josh Rogin pointed out on Twitter, Bill Gates dismisses the lab leak theory by telling Trevor Noah it's quite clear in this case that it came across through animals. But the whole point of the theory is that the bats and the animals it may have come through were both at the Wuhan lab. So this is so frustrating because, yes, it in all likelihood came from bats, but they were researching bats. They were doing work on bats in the laboratory. So the question is whether bats in the wild, without having been manipulated by scientists or been experimented on in labs, bats infected some other animal that then infected humans, maybe at the wet market. That's one idea. The other idea being, no, they took these bats that were in these caves and they did research on them and they manipulated the viruses they had, and then there was a contamination at the lab. Someone got sick, and that's what touched off the pandemic. Those are the two theories. We don't know for sure which one it is. You can point to some reasons to think one, and you can point to some reasons to think the other. A lot of the debunking of it definitively came from this wet market. It's garbage. We're still looking for this other animal. The other animal, which we found, last time there was a pandemic, was found very swiftly. It's not out there in the wild, so we still have a lot of questions. So the way he, just dismissed that. With an answer that doesn't even make any sense. That doesn't dismiss that at all.
You could tell he knew he was gaslighting too, because at the point he said that, it's very clear. He kind of crossed his arms, not to do the body language expert thing from Joy Ann Reid, but that was some A-level gaslighting. It is frustrating because when you were in a position like Trevor Noah, I wonder, I don't know if he's done other segments talking about lab leak theory. I feel like at this point, it has been mainstreamed enough and allowed in public discourse enough that Bill Gates wouldn't be able to get away with saying things like that without a certain degree of pushback. But it can be tough when you're in that interviewing chair, throwing something like that on the spot. So when emphasizing that, it's very clear to have the chutzpah to push back where necessary.
Yeah, he didn't technically lie, though, right? So he's saying, well, it came from an animal.
Right.
Like Robby's saying, yeah, maybe an animal in a lab that they were testing, and then they manipulated the virus, and then, and then it got out. And so, he wasn't really lying. So, of course, yes, okay, fine, it came from an animal. But that doesn't negate the fact that it maybe came from an animal that then was tested on, and then it made it more virulent, and then it escaped from that lab, and maybe perhaps had it just jumped from an animal, it's possible it never would have been able to jump from an animal to a person. That is maybe what they were manipulating in the lab, because that's what they were studying, was how do viruses transmit from animal to human. How do you study that without actually attempting to do it, right? That's
something we didn't really need to know until we did it and infected the entire world with this horrible disease. And he was using it the way he said that Bill Gates was pivoting away from a very important question about lab standards and lab safety. It is totally legitimate for the American people, the people of Earth, everyone, to have questions about our governments, other governments, funding, conducting these research through some partnerships with other governments, through medical groups. This research, of which Dr. Fauci has been this foremost advocate, then being conducted under lab situations that maybe we don't have full control over. Maybe there's these labs. The Wuhan lab got bad, horrible safety reviews. We don't know the full extent of it because the Chinese government won't tell us. But there's so many reasons for concern, and he was very much pivoting away from that, I expect, because he wants to fund, all sorts of scientific research without anybody, getting his way, asking too many questions about lab safety. But lab safety is I'm concerned about it, even if it is true that the disease totally originated naturally, like HIV, like some other diseases. like, even if that's all true, I still don't know about whether this research is this research does seem reckless to me.
And the reason, to be clear, well, they don't want that connection to be drawn is because the liability would be in a monetary amount that is more than has ever existed in the history of the planet. You know, nobody wants to be on the hook for the disaster of the last 2 years.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's just not, it's crazy the way this gets, and remember, this theory, which again is still a theory, we don't know for sure. I think it's reasonable to guess in one direction or the other. This was something, you were shamed for discussing first by the Washington, not by Josh Rogan, who's terrific on this stuff, but other people in the mainstream media, made it sound like you were a crazy, paranoid conspiracy theorist if you thought it had some plausibility. Then it was something you were literally not allowed to talk about on social media, in part because aspects of our government were encouraging social media sites to clamp down on this conversation, weirdly trying to portray this conversation as racist, as reflecting a racial bias against Asian people, which makes no sense, and if anything is the reverse. The theory that this is due to a specific Chinese cultural food and animal practices is the reason we have this disease involves much more kind of racial stereotyping, and it involves race in a much bigger way than the theory that a lab with poor safety administered by an authoritarian government is the responsible party, and in part with funding through our own government. That is by far the less race involving reality. And whatever way it is whatever way it is. If it is the case that this is because of Chinese cultural practices, like, that's the reality, and we have to grapple with that and condemn it if we feel or criticize it if we feel it should be criticized. But the attempt to have one be the more primary explanation than the other, because racism was totally backwards anyway. So for shame.
Everybody's a suspect. That's what I say. Everyone's still a suspect. Even the bat.
Colonel Mustard in the greenhouse with the lead pipe. Yeah, that's what I think. All right, well, the Pope made some heads turn yesterday over his comments on the Ukraine war and NATO, so we'll discuss that coming up next.